If you love sweeping historical narratives that bring entire eras to life, or if you enjoy biographies that treat political and cultural history with equal depth, or if you appreciate thoughtful, elegant prose shaped by decades of scholarship, and if you want to see how one of the most ambitious historical projects of the 20th century comes to its final dramatic conclusion, if so, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing The Age of Napoleon by Will and Ariel Durant. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and on this channel, I read across genres and across history, from epic fantasy and literary fiction to political biography and sweeping historical works. My goal is to give you thoughtful, long-form reviews so you know exactly what to expect when you pick up a book. And today's book is a meaningful one for me. I am here reviewing The Age of Napoleon by Will and Ariel Durant. This is the 11th book in this epic historic series. And this is the final book that they wrote. And it covers, as it says, a history of European civilization from 1789 to 1815. So we have a lot to go over because in addition to taking a look at this book specifically, I will have some thoughts about the actual series itself, a project that I have been working on for a long time to make my way through all of these books. I actually have started several times. And then finally, maybe 2.5 years ago, I sat down, I said, I'm going to read 10 pages a day of this series. And lo and behold, I have finally finished it. I actually finished it over the summer, I must confess, but it has taken me this long to get to the review because it was a daunting review. The book itself was daunting, but also trying to give some final thoughts on the series as a whole have all made it a bit of a challenge to finally get to, but here we are. And so now, I must say, this book, The Age of Napoleon, it captures the final act of the Enlightenment story while also charting the rise of one of history's most significant and controversial figures. And it is a volume that blends revolution, political economy, social upheaval, and the sheer force of Napoleon's personality into a single cohesive narrative. And as a finale to the series, it also carries both the weight of history and the weight of a considerable conclusion. Before we go on, I do have a few things that I want to do just as a recap. I know I've mentioned these in some of my other videos. I have entire other videos committed to actually introducing this series as a whole, but just so you know, I do want to give a little recap and maybe give a little bit more background information, and just so it's all here. But of course, you're more than welcome to go check out all of my other videos related to this series, including, of course, the introduction to it all. Before I dive into the book itself, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the journey this volume represents. Over the past several years, I have read and reviewed every single book in the story of civilization and collected all of those reviews into a dedicated playlist on my channel. If you have been following along, you know how expansive and ambitious the Durants project is. Each volume builds on the last, tracing the development of human society across centuries and continents, from ancient Mesopotamia to the Enlightenment. With The Age of Napoleon, that playlist now reaches its completion. If you are new to the series, or if you want to follow the Durants' work from the beginning, I encourage you to check out that playlist. It offers a full arc of world history as told through one of the most influential narrative history projects of the 20th century. It has been a rewarding experience to read and review each volume, and I hope the playlist serves as a helpful guide for anyone interested in exploring the series themselves. So please, check out that playlist. Now, one last time, let me give you a brief biography of the authors Will and Ariel Durant. Will Durant, who was born in 1885 and died in 1981, and Ariel Durant, who was born in 1898 and died in 1981. They both lived pretty long lives, although he was notably a little older than her. A little bit of a controversy. We'll get to that. They, of course, stand among the most influential popular historians of the 20th century. Their collaboration, which produced this, The Story of Civilization, as I've said, an 11-volume, multi-decade project that aimed to present world history in a narrative form accessible to general readers, well-grounded in careful scholarship. Will began his career as a philosophy teacher and lecturer, and he was known for his ability to synthesize complex ideas into elegant, readable prose. Ariel, who was actually originally one of his students, became his intellectual partner, co-author, and collaborator across the later volumes. She actually was a collaborator from the beginning, but she got notice, especially when she would get credit for being an actual author in the later books. And together, these two developed a distinct historical voice. They combined broad cultural synthesis with vivid portraits of individuals, institutions, and philosophical movements. Their writing balanced narrative storytelling with interpretive insight, enabling them to connect political developments with literature, as well as art, economics, religion, and philosophy, while their work reflects the historiographical approach of its mid-century context, it remains admired for its narrative coherence, clarity, and above all, its ambition. Will Durant was actually born in North Adams, Massachusetts, to French-Canadian immigrant parents. He studied at St. Peter's College in New Jersey before earning his master's and doctoral degrees in philosophy from Columbia University. His early career was shaped by a deep engagement with philosophy and education. He worked as a teacher, a journalist, and a lecturer, and he became known for his gift for explaining complex philosophical ideas in clear, compelling prose. His commitment to accessible education shaped his lifelong project, integrating intellectual history with broader cultural, political, and social context. His wife, Ariel Durant, was born in Chaya Kaufman in present-day Ukraine, and she immigrated to the United States as a child. She grew up in a working-class, multilingual immigrant family in the Lower East Side of New York, and at age 15, she became Will Durant's student, and of course later in life, his partner, both in relationship as well in scholarship. Her background rooted in resilience and cultural adaptation and firsthand experience with displacement added an essential dimension to their collective work. And so while Will brought philosophical training and broad historical vision, Ariel contributed narrative vigor as well as emotional insight and a grounding in lived experience that enriched their joint historical voice. Together, they became one of the most remarkable intellectual partnerships of the 20th century. And although Will wrote the earlier volumes of The Story of Civilization alone, Ariel increasingly became an active collaborator, beginning with the Renaissance, and was credited as co-author starting with the Age of Louis XIV. Her influence grew steadily, shaping the tone, structure, and interpretive framing of all of the later volumes. Although you can tell that she was pretty involved in the early volumes as well as the editor. I think from the get-go she was known to help edit and definitely helped give it a certain voice, and you will also see her take on a bigger role. It becomes pretty evident as you go through the later volumes that you can also see where she got more of a say in exactly how things were written, and exactly as I said with that narrative approach, particularly the groundedness coming from her own background, that element of resilience, all of that is much more notable in the later volumes. It is also worth noting, I know that this is what they're most famous for, but they do have several other books that they wrote. Will wrote The Story of Philosophy and published it in 1926. It was one of his earliest works. It was his most famous early work. It is actually what introduced major Western thinkers to a broad audience, and it actually remains one of the most influential popular philosophy books that has ever been written, and it is what gave them the money that made it possible for them to take on the massive endeavor of writing the first book in the series, which of course led to the next book until we have 11. In 1968, they wrote together The Lessons of History, where the authors tried to distill the themes and patterns and tensions that they observed across the entire sweep of the story of civilization. That came in 68. The last volume was just a few years after that, so it actually is near the end, but not quite when they'd finished everything. And then they actually had a dual autobiography in 1977, which they published after the Age of Napoleon, and it offers a very reflective and personal account of the partnership, their writing process, and their shared intellectual life. And as I've now said many times, together, Will and Ariel Durant, who committed 4 decades to the study of human civilization, they brought to this world a work that was reflective and interpretive. It had tendencies, as I've said, that were reflective of the time, and certainly there is some room for some criticism of that, which I'll get into. But none of that can take away the fact that this is an incredibly ambitious and an incredibly impressive project, and something that I'm grateful exists. Regardless of the criticisms, there is so much to appreciate about not just this volume, but of course as this series as a whole. But I will save some time at the end for a little more reflection. Let's talk a little bit about this whole series and then dig into this final volume. So, The Story of Civilization is, as I've said, incredibly ambitious. Of course, with its sheer number of pages and volumes. It is 11 volumes, and I think I also already said this, it was published over 4 decades. A lot happens in those 4 decades. It is actually first published in the 1920s, and the final volume comes out in the 1970s. So we're talking about a whole lot going on around the world, including the Second World War, the Great Depression was still underway, the Cold War, and so there's just a lot of transformation that is happening during the time that these books are being published. And so it makes it all the more interesting that this, of course, is going to cover from the beginning of written history into modernity to a certain degree, although definitely not into contemporary or 20th century with major technological revolutions, but certainly on a moment of irreversible political revolutions and changes that become a defining feature of the 19th and 20th century European world, which of course goes on to affect the rest of the world. Looking at this series as a whole, it's worth noting that the early volumes explore the foundations of human society, beginning with ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China, of course, before moving through the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. Really, most of anything outside of Europe is only found in the first volume. You do get some tangential information from, say, the rise of the Middle East as you're exploring medieval Europe. You have a little bit of discussion of Africa, especially North Africa, again, in combination with the rest of the Islamic world. But by and large, you are focusing, especially in the volumes after the first one, almost entirely on the European civilization. And I realize that is, in and of itself, one heck of a Gordian knot to untie here in a single video, but that is generally how I would describe everything since the first volume. Just to name those volumes, just in case you're not aware of them, but to give you an idea of what they cover, the first one is, of course, the life of Greece. The second one is Caesar and Christ. The third one is about the medieval time period. That is called the Age of Faith. The fifth one is the Renaissance. Then the sixth one is the Reformation. All, of course, pretty obvious names when thinking about European history. It follows a pretty typical flow. And then you get to the Age of Reason begins. And the next four are all essentially the Enlightenment that has been split up. And this is also pretty common when you do an anthology like this of history. You are going to see that the closer you get to the present, the shorter time period and sometimes the larger the chapters are, because we just have more information. You also have more moving parts usually that you need to be able to account for. And that's exactly what happens here. So then the next four books, which all deal with the Age of Enlightenment, are the Age of Reason begins, the Age of Louis XIV, the Age of Voltaire, and then Rousseau and Revolution. And then, which brings us to this final one, the Age of Napoleon, which is, well, we'll get to exactly what it represents. It is both a beginning of a post-Enlightenment world, but also in many ways is very much still steeped in the development of the Enlightenment and the repercussions of it. And that's essentially the reason why it becomes the final book, as well as they personally ran out of time. But there is a sense of finality when they wrote it. To be fair, there's a sense of finality in almost every book that they wrote. Probably volumes like 6 through 11, there was a certain sense of finality that they didn't know exactly where they would end. But it seems like by the time they wrote The Age of Napoleon, they were comfortable with this being at least a stopping point. Had they lived longer, would they have maybe picked up something else and looked into the mid-19th century and seen what they exactly wanted to write about? Maybe, but unfortunately, they did not have that opportunity. And so here we are with the final of all of these 11 books. And it is a fascinating read, to be sure. With that in mind, let's take a look at the Age of Napoleon. In this volume, the Durants examined the last great convulsion of the 18th century and the forces that shaped the modern world. The French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, the geopolitical reshaping of Europe, and the enduring cultural consequences of this era all come together in a sweeping final narrative. The book opens with the intellectual and economic pressures that contributed to the collapse of the old regime. The Durants trace the revolution not simply as a political event, but as the culmination of Enlightenment ideals colliding with entrenched social structures. From there, the volume follows Napoleon's extraordinary ascent, his military genius, his administrative reforms, his authoritarian tendencies, and the paradoxical legacy that continues to shape European identity. But the Age of Napoleon is more than a biography. It is a cultural history of Europe at the turn of the 20th century. The Durants devote considerable attention to Britain, Germany, Central Europe, and the arts and sciences that blossomed during and after the Napoleonic period. They treat the era as a moment of intense creativity and profound instability, a time in which political revolutions spurred artistic, philosophical, and economic transformation. As a conclusion to the Story of Civilizations series, the book ties together many of the themes that the Durants have explored across the earlier volumes, such as the role of great individuals in history. They certainly are fans of great man history. The tension between liberty and order, the cycles of revolution and reaction, and the cultural forces that shape societies over time. The volume ends not with a definitive conclusion, but with a recognition that civilization continues to evolve beyond the scope of any single series. It is a fitting into a project defined by intellectual ambition and sweeping historical vision. Of course, this was a huge book. So let me actually dig into the details of the book. We will take a look at each of the major books, which each book covers somewhere between 5 to 7 chapters or so, and I'll tell you what is covered. I won't, of course, name every single chapter. That would take too long, but I will give you an idea of the scope of each section of this book. So let's take a look at Book 1, The French Revolution. This covers chapters 1 through 6. Book 1 of The Age of Napoleon traces the origins, dynamics, and consequences of the French Revolution. For the Durants, the revolution is not a sudden explosion, but the culmination of long-standing tensions within 18th century France. In these opening chapters, they emphasize the intellectual, economic, and social pressures that made the collapse of the old regime almost inevitable. They begin by examining the structural weaknesses of the Bourbon monarchy, the mounting debt, the uneven tax system, and the inability of the aristocracy and clergy to adapt to the changing economic realities of the time. The Enlightenment looms large in this narrative. The Durants credit philosophers and salons with planting the seeds of skepticism toward monarchy, privilege, and inherited authority. Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu become background characters driving cultural transformation long before political upheaval arrives in France. The early revolutionary period receives careful attention. You have the calling of the Estates General, the rise of the National Assembly, and the symbolic significance of the tennis court oath that are all presented as steps in a process driven as much by public psychology as by political maneuvering. Then, of course, you have the storming of the Bastille. It becomes, for the Durants, a moment of myth-making as much as of revolution. It's a dramatic episode that galvanized the nation and announced the arrival of a new political age. They then turn to the unfolding radicalization, the economic distress, factionalism, and the war that pushed events beyond the control of moderate reformers. The Durants describe this progression with both sympathy, but also with great caution, noting how idealism and fear intertwined to produce cycles of violence. So you have figures like Danton, Marat, Robespierre are presented not as caricatures, but as individuals swept up in forces larger than themselves. So by the end of Book 1, the revolution has entered its most tumultuous phase. The monarchy is falling, the reign of terror looms, and the political experiment that began with Enlightenment hopes has transformed into something far more unstable and unpredictable. These chapters lay the foundation for Napoleon's later ascent by showing how a society pushed to extremes creates both opportunities and dangers for the emergence of exceptional individuals. Which brings us to Book 2, Napoleon Ascendant, which covers chapters 7 through 14. Book 2 traces the remarkable rise of Napoleon Bonaparte from a young, ambitious Corsican officer to the most powerful political and military figure in France. The Durants treat his ascent not simply as a story of individual brilliance, but as the product of a society destabilized by revolution and desperate for order and direction and, of course, some kind of victory. They begin by situating Napoleon within the shifting political landscape of post-revolutionary France. You have the Directory, which is plagued by corruption. You have factionalism and administrative weakness. And they inadvertently create the conditions in which a decisive and charismatic figure like Napoleon can thrive. The army, transformed by revolutionary fervor, provides Napoleon with the institutional platform that he needs. It is in the Italian campaigns that he first reveals his genius. The Durants describe these campaigns with a bit of admiration, noting the combination of strategy, innovation, personal discipline, and force of personality that made Napoleon stand out among France's generals. The chapters follow his rapid accumulation of influence. The Egyptian campaign, though strategically questionable, it demonstrates his ability to capture public imagination, even in what was ultimately a significant failure. And here the Durants blend military narrative with cultural context, discussing Napoleon's fascination with antiquity and his attempt to cast himself as a modern Alexander the Great. The campaign's military shortcomings are balanced by its intellectual aspirations and political consequences, both of which shape Napoleon's legend. As France continues to struggle with instability at home, Napoleon's return becomes a turning point. The coup of 18 Brumaire is presented not simply as a seizure of power, but as a carefully orchestrated response to political paralysis. The Durants emphasize Napoleon's ability to read the moment. France wanted stability, efficiency, and a restoration of national pride. And so as first consul, He delivers with administrative reforms, centralization, and a renewed sense of direction. So by the end of Book 2, Napoleon has positioned himself as the indispensable leader of France. His blend of military triumph, administrative reform, and personal magnetism propels him toward the imperial stage. These chapters capture the energy of a nation rebuilding itself around a single figure and preparing for the unprecedented transformation that his rule will bring. Which brings us to Book 3, Britain, which covers chapters 15 through 24. In Book 3, the Durants shift their attention from the upheavals of France to the world of Britain between 1789 and 1812. They present Britain as a nation undergoing its own profound transformation, not shaped by the political revolution, but by the intensifying industrial revolution. These chapters begin with England at work, tracing the economic and social conditions of the era. You have factories and mechanized production that reshape the landscape, creating new wealth and deepening inequality. You have workers that face harsh conditions, and the Durants describe the mounting pressure that give rise to early critics such as Robert Owen. You have economic theory, which becomes central to national debate as classical economists like Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus grapple with population growth, wages, and the consequences of industrial expansion. The narrative then turns to English life, offering a broad sociological portrait of the classes, the government institutions, religion, education, and social customs. Britain appears simultaneously stable as well as strained. The monarchy and parliament maintain continuity, yet the working classes endure insecurity and poverty. Religion remains a largely conservative force, while figures like Mary Wollstonecraft challenge traditional gender norms and moral standards. The Durants evoke a society marked by rigid manners, expanding literacy, and a vibrant theater culture that mirrors both the hopes and anxieties of the time. British artistic life receives detailed attention. The Durants trace developments in painting and architecture, from caricaturists like Gilray to the rise of landscape mastery in Constable and the dazzling, emotionally charged canvases of Turner, and these artists reflect both the natural beauty and industrial unease of the age. Science flourishes as well. Advances in physics, chemistry, biology, and medicine reflect Britain's growing intellectual energy. Rumford, Dalton, Davy, Erasmus, Darwin, and Jenner symbolize a culture increasingly shaped by experimentation and empirical inquiry. Their work strengthens Britain's growing industrial and military power. Philosophy and literature are equally dynamic. Debates over Christianity, political justice, population, and law animate thinkers such as Paine, Godwin, Malthus, and Bentham. Literature stands at a moment of transition, with Jane Austen refining the novel's social realism, while William Blake opens new paths in visionary poetry and art. You have the Lake poets, especially Wordsworth and Coleridge, who define the early Romantic movement. Their poetry blends emotional introspection with reflection on nature, revolution, and human experience. You have the rebel poets, Byron and Shelley. They embody a more tempestuous romanticism driven by scandal, exile, and radical politics. The section concludes with Britain's geopolitical ascendancy. You have Lord Pitt's leadership and, of course, Admiral Nelson's naval triumphs and the victory at Trafalgar, which positioned Britain as Napoleon's steadfast adversary, shaping the broader European conflict, which brings us to Book 4, The Challenged Kings, and this covers chapters 25 through 34. And it widens the lens from France and Britain to the rest of Europe between 1789 and 1812, showing how monarchies and societies across the continent responded to the pressures of revolution, as well as war and, above all, Napoleonic expansion. The Durants begin in Iberia, where Portugal and Spain experience political turbulence as France's ambitions disrupt long-standing dynasties. Spain's collapse in 1808, combined with the brutality of French occupation, leads to the Peninsular War, a conflict that drains Napoleon's resources and elevates Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, whose disciplined leadership foreshadows Napoleon's eventual defeat. The Durants treat Iberia as the first clear sign that the Napoleonic system contains its own limits. Italy forms the next major focal point. Fragmented at the end of the 18th century, the peninsula becomes one of Napoleon's proving grounds. The Durants trace the political and cultural reshaping of Italy under French influence, administrative reforms, military campaigns, the fraught relationship between Napoleon and the papacy, and the rise of Antonio Canova, whose neoclassical sculptures represent an artistic ideal at odds with the continent's political instability. Italy becomes both a beneficiary as well as a victim of Napoleonic modernization. Then Austria receives a similar examination. Enlightened despots such as Joseph II attempt modernization from above, but the Habsburg Empire struggles to adapt to revolutionary pressures. The Durants spotlight Francis II, the cautious emperor who presides over Austria's defeats and reorganizations. Metternich emerges as a rising diplomat, shaping the conservative political responses that will define a post-Napoleonic Europe. Vienna's artistic and intellectual life remains vibrant, culminating in a full chapter on Beethoven. His development from prodigy to the creator of the heroic symphonies embodies the era's turbulence, ambition, and emotional intensity. Germany's political fragmentation becomes another crucial context. The Holy Roman Empire dissolves, the Confederation of the Rhine rises under French influence, and Prussia experiences catastrophic defeat followed by internal renewal. Parallel to the political story, the Durants present a cultural portrait of Germany's economy, religion, education, arts, music, and theater during this transformative period. German literature and philosophy receive extended treatment as well. Goethe, Schiller, Hölderlin, the Schlegel brothers, and novelists and dramatists of the age reflect the intellectual ferment that shapes Romanticism. Philosophy moves in equally bold directions, with Fichte's nationalism and Schelling's metaphysics of nature and Hegel's sweeping philosophical system on history and mind and morality and, of course, the state. The final chapters survey Europe's periphery. You have Switzerland's neutrality, Sweden and Denmark's political shifts, Poland's struggles for survival and existence, and the Ottoman Empire's gradual decline. Russia closes the section with the Durants examining the reigns of Paul I and Alexander I, the intellectual life of St. Petersburg and Moscow, the flourishing of Russian literature and art, and the fragile alliance between Alexander and Napoleon on the eve of its collapse. Which brings us to Book 5. Book 5 of the final book in this whole series. Book 5, Finale. It covers chapters 35 through 40. Book 5 of the Age of Napoleon brings the Durants' long narrative to its dramatic and inevitable close, tracing Napoleon's final rise, his collapse, his resurgence, and the end. The section begins with the Continental Blockade, Napoleon's attempt to strangle British commerce and starve his most persistent enemy. The Durants describe the deep economic depression this policy triggers within France itself, weakening public confidence in the empire and eroding the stability that has sustained Napoleon for over a decade. As political miscalculations mount, the path to war with Russia becomes unavoidable. The chapters on the march to Moscow recount one of the most catastrophic military campaigns in European history. The Durants detail the immense logistical challenges, the exhaustion of the Grand Army, and Napoleon's misreading of Russian strategy. The occupation of Moscow, followed immediately by the city's destruction by fire, represents both a symbolic triumph and a practical disaster. The long retreat, marked by hunger, cold, and continual harassment, shatters the army and the illusion of Napoleon's invincibility. From the defeat, the Durants followed the unraveling of the empire in 1813 and 1814. Coalition forces push into Central Europe, and Napoleon executes a series of defensive campaigns against Berlin, Prague, and the Rhine, displaying flashes of his former brilliance even as the strategic situation collapses. Paris falls, the Allies impose peace, and Napoleon is exiled to Elba. Yet, even in exile, he retains enormous charisma and determination. Which brings us to his return in 1815, the legendary 100 Days, which forms the climax of the narrative, in which the Durants recount the Congress of Vienna, the uneasy restoration of Louis XVIII, and Napoleon's astonishing journey from Elba to Paris, where soldiers and citizens alike rally immediately to him. The final campaign begins in Belgium. The battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras, the rain-soaked march through mud, and at last, Waterloo, where miscommunication, weather, and Wellington's resilience combine to end Napoleon's power forever. The last chapters trace the remainder of Napoleon's life after the second abdication. The Durants describe his capture, the Second Bourbon Restoration, and his confinement on St. Helena under the stern supervision of Sir Hudson Lowe. Here the narrative becomes more intimate, Napoleon's daily routines, his companions, his health, and his reflective, sometimes self-mythologizing conversations, and of course ultimately his death in 1821 closes the personal story. The section ends with an afterword on Napoleon's family and legacy, offering a perspective on his long-term impact on law, administration, nationalism, and the modern state. The Durants treat him as both a world historical figure and a man ultimately brought down by overreach and, of course, by circumstances. And that is it. That's it. That is it. That is the final book in the series. Of course, there are some things I'd like to point out, some argumentative distinctions, but I must say, that's it. That's the whole book. That's the whole series. That's all of it. Whew. Boy, What a journey it's been. However, I'd like to point out a few argumentative distinctions. Now, these are distinct for this book specifically, but it's worth pointing out that many of these will apply to pretty much the whole story of civilization because it has to do with the Durants' approach to writing about history. But here are some things that I find very important to note about what exactly they are trying to say. One of the defining strengths of this book is the clarity with which Will and Ariel Durant make their interpretive commitments visible. Their narrative is not simply descriptive, it reflects a set of arguments about the meaning of the Napoleonic era and its place within this story, the broader arc of the story of civilization. So first, the Durants present the French Revolution and Napoleon as deeply interconnected phenomena. They resist the temptation to draw a sharp line between revolutionary idealism and Napoleonic authoritarianism. Instead, they argue that Napoleon emerged from the revolution's internal contradictions. The violence, the instability, and ideological ferment of the 1790s created the conditions in which a figure of extraordinary ambition and organizational genius could take command. In their telling, Napoleon does not betray the revolution so much as channel and codify into a new political form. Second, the Durants maintain their long-standing thesis that civilization is shaped by an interplay of great individuals as well as broader structural forces. Napoleon is undeniably a great man in their narrative, hence the name of the book. He's a military innovator, a political reformer, and a cultural patron. But the Durants also show how economic pressures, demographic shifts, wars of ideology, and the intellectual legacy of the Enlightenment limited and shaped his actions. He becomes a node in a larger landscape of historical pressures rather than an autonomous force. Third, they frame the Napoleonic era as a turning point in the creation of the modern state. Administrative centralization, legal codification, secular education, and the reorganization of Europe's political boundaries all resonate far beyond Napoleon's defeat. The Durants argue that even in failure, Napoleon left institutional legacies that reshaped Europe's governmental and social architecture. In this sense, the Napoleonic era is both an ending and a beginning. It's the close of one phase of the Enlightenment and the opening of a new political age defined by nationalism, bureaucracy, and mass mobilization. Finally, the Durants emphasize the cultural dimensions of this period, as they do in all of their books. They emphasize art, literature, philosophy, and science, and they're not treated as background material but as integral components of historical development. By devoting full chapters to figures like Beethoven, or to the Lake Poets, or to the German idealism, and to emerging romantic movements, they argue that the Napoleonic age was as much a cultural revolution as it was a political or military one. These interpretive threads give the volume coherence and align it with the broader intellectual vision that has guided this entire series. With that being said, here is my personal reaction. I enjoyed the Age of Napoleon greatly. As with the previous volumes, the Durants cast an extraordinarily wide net. They move seamlessly from the great figures of the age to the underlying social, economic, and cultural forces that shaped the world that Napoleon inherited and transformed. The book earns its title. It is certainly about Napoleon, but it is equally about the era that produced him, the movements that sustained him, and the artistic and intellectual revolutions that unfolded alongside his political one. One of the pleasures of reading the Durants is their commitment to breadth. They rarely confine themselves to political or military history. Instead, they bring in everything they can: the economics of the continental blockade, the social dislocation of industrial England, the development of romantic poetry, the evolution of German philosophy, the shifting power dynamics in Russia and Austria, and the countless smaller currents that make up the texture of an age. The approach gives the volume a richness and density that makes the narrative feel truly comprehensive. The reliance on primary sources remains one of their great strengths. They quote letters, diaries, poems, and essays with a clear respect for the voices of the past. These quotations give the era an immediacy that pure narration would not achieve, allowing readers to see events through the eyes of those who lived them. Even when dealing with well-known figures like Napoleon or Beethoven or Wordsworth, the Durants find personal moments that humanize them and complicate their reputations. And finally, the writing itself is as captivating as ever. The Durants maintain a tone that is elevated without being inaccessible. It's lyrical without drifting into sentimentality. They have a rare ability to make large historical processes feel intimate and human, and intimate personal stories feel connected to broader cultural trends. As a concluding volume, The Age of Napoleon delivers exactly what I hoped for: a sweeping, elegant, and satisfying finale to a long historical journey. Now let me also give a personal reaction to the series as a whole, and not just to that final volume. I must say, I have loved reading The Story of Civilization. Finishing this series feels like completing a long intellectual journey with guides who are both deeply knowledgeable and genuinely passionate about the human past. The sheer ambition of the project remains extraordinary. Few historians would even attempt to synthesize world history across thousands of pages, let alone to do with the stylistic grace and narrative coherence that Will and Ariel Durant achieved. Their ability to weave political history with philosophy, literature, art, religion, and economics is as impressive now as it must have felt when the volumes were first published. Of course, that being said, reading the full series has also clarified some of its limitations. I have learned over time that the Durants have very ardent supporters, and whenever I've mentioned even mild criticisms, the responses have been noticeable. But I stand by most of these critiques. The series is undeniably Eurocentric, especially in its early volumes. No, really, all the way through. Actually, the earliest volume is the least Eurocentric, but I think that the volumes that they chose to start out with defined the rest of the project in a way that made it entirely Eurocentric. I'd also say that the civilizations of Asia, Africa, the global south, they appear at best as a background influence than as an important dynamic part of the world in their own right. And I do think that this is partly a matter of the Durant's own training and partly a reflection of the publishing expectations of their era. I'm not going to pretend like they were not part of the mid 20th century. But I do also think that it's something that every modern reader must keep in mind. You can't just say, oh, well, that was the past, therefore I don't have to contextualize it. No, you still need to contextualize it. You still need to make a note of it. I think that's an important criticism, and it's never going to go away. It doesn't mean that it's not an awesome series. It is. It's incredibly well done, but it has those limitations, and you have to be aware of those. And don't pretend like they're not there. This is something that I keep getting flack for. People can't seem to understand it, that yes, it's great, and yes, I can contextualize it, but it's still important stuff to be aware of if you're going to read these. And as I've said, I also think that the early volumes in particular show a tendency toward, I'm going to say, stereotyping. The Durants, I think, aim for a narrative energy and a broad cultural portrait, and I think sometimes those attempts just flatten complexity a little more than I'm comfortable with. I realize we have limitations in many respects. We only have one source that covers major events, and so sometimes that flattened depiction is all that we really have. But I think in the earliest volumes, they just once or twice in pretty egregious fashions, and then probably at least a dozen times or so in maybe not as egregious fashions, but still something that I thought was just a little more stereotype and a little less academically rigorous. That's my opinion. I stand by it. Again, I understand, product of their time. Again, I understand that publishing expectations and the world that they lived in all shaped that. But hey, that's also the thing that they were adamant about, was trying to show the world that shaped what they were writing about. And so I think that that is a perfectly fair criticism to make. I think that their categories are occasionally just a little too neat. I think that their generalizations can be just a little too sweeping. And again, I know that it's not unusual for synthetic works of this scale, but it reminds us that their interpretations are frameworks and they are not final verdicts. And that's something to remember when you consider the whole of humanity or the history of an individual. Finally, as impressive as their writing and knowledge are, it is worth remembering they were not engaging with the full breadth of current academic scholarship even in their own time. That would have been impossible for two people working alone. They read widely, but no pair of authors can fully absorb the rigorous, specialized work that undergirds modern historical study. Their analysis remains thoughtful, but it does not replace the insights of more targeted academic research. And I know a lot of people hate me saying that, but it is true. You cannot be a generalist for everything and have as good of work as specialists on those particular things. And it's the culminative work of those specialists that gives us the best work that we need to write comprehensive stuff like this. All of that being said, none of these critiques diminish the value of this series. The Story of Civilization is a monumental achievement, a work of narrative history that remains readable, engaging, and thought-provoking decades after its publication. It deserves both admiration and some critical reflection, because all work deserves critical reflection. But I am incredibly grateful to have spent so much time with it. And I highly suspect that I will probably read this series again. Although, just like the Durants, it may take me 3 or 4 decades to do so. So who is this book for? Well, this book is for readers who appreciate large-scale narrative history, especially those who enjoy seeing political events framed within a wide cultural and intellectual context. If you are someone who wants to understand Napoleon, not only as a general or statesman, but as part of a much larger ecosystem of ideas, institutions, and artistic currents, this volume will reward you. It is ideal for readers who value synthesis, who like seeing philosophy explained alongside military campaigns, and who enjoy a writing style that aims to elevate rather than to oversimplify. It is also a great fit for anyone already committed to the story of civilization. The Durants' strengths remain fully on display. Their clarity, their command of prose, and their desire to make history a fundamentally human story, full of ideas and personalities. If you are drawn to long biographies, sweeping world histories, or deeply contextual studies of major historical figures, this book should absolutely be on your list. Finally, it works for readers who want a single volume, elegant narrative of the Napoleonic age without wading into the denser, more specialized academic literature. It balances breadth and readability in a way that few historians can do. Who is this not for? Well, this book is not for readers who prefer tightly focused historical studies with a narrow analytical lens. The Durants roam widely, and part of the joy of the volume is its expansiveness. That also means it may feel diffuse or meandering, or someone who wants a strictly chronological military or political history of Napoleon. If you're looking for a deep dive into a single battle or policy or archival debate, this is not the book that will give you that level of granularity. It is also not ideal for readers who rely heavily on the most up-to-date academic scholarship. The Durants write with confidence and elegance, but their work predates decades of specialized research on the Napoleonic era, as well as on gender history and colonialism and economic systems and global historiography. Modern scholars sometimes challenge their generalizations, and this series does not reflect contemporary approaches to global or comparative history. And finally, this book may not resonate with those who dislike long-form historical narrative. At more than 1,000 pages, The Age of Napoleon requires patience. It is designed to be read slowly, absorbed in layers, and appreciated for its prose as much as its content. If you want something concise, or fast-paced, or exclusively argument-driven, this volume will probably feel a bit overwhelming and not quite going the direction you would like it to. Finishing, The Age of Napoleon feels like closing the last chapter of one of the most ambitious historical undertakings ever attempted. As a single volume, it delivers everything the Durants do best: a sweeping sense of narrative, an eye for culture and intellectual detail, and a willingness to treat history as a deeply human story full of contradictions as well as triumphs and failures. It captures the magnitude of Napoleon's world while never losing sight of the many voices and movements and ideas that defined his age. But as the final installment in the story of civilization, it carries added weight. This series as a whole has accompanied me through political revolutions, religious transformations, philosophical breakthroughs, artistic evolutions, and the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Few works attempt this scope, and even fewer achieve it with this kind of grace. The Durants may not always align with contemporary academic methods, and their lens is undeniably shaped by their own era. But boy, the achievement remains monumental. Their narrative invites readers to see connections across centuries and cultures, to appreciate the interplay of great figures and ordinary lives, and to remember that ideas and art are as essential to civilization as armies and governments. As a project of historical storytelling, the story of civilization stands nearly alone. It demands time, it demands patience, it demands curiosity, and it demands a willingness to sit with its strengths and its limitations. But the payoff is extraordinary. Reading it in full has been rewarding, challenging, and at its best, deeply inspiring. Of course, I would love to know your thoughts on this book, or on any of the books in the story of civilization, or any of the books by Will and Ariel Durant. Please let me know what you're thinking in the comments. And while you're here, please check out more of my videos. Of course, there's all the videos from this series that you can check out, but I also have other long-running series. I also have a wide variety of books that you can check out reviews for. And please, if you're enjoying my videos, share them. The more people that know about my channel, the more videos I can make. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.